Welcome back. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni says South Africa can't spend its way out of the COVID-19 crisis, but he has announced that government will be taking on more debt to fund all of its priorities. In June, Mboweni laid out an active scenario in which debt would stabilise at 87% of GDP or the total economy over the next 3 years. On the new trajectory announced today, GDP will rise to as much as 95% of GDP over the next 5 years. An important step to ensuring that debt does not spiral out of control and South Africa avoids defaulting on its obligations is a proposed wage freeze in the public sector. Government workers have been aggrieved since February after the minister said government could not grant salary increases this year as per an earlier agreement. Another controversial announcement today, SAA are being allocated 10.5 billion rand to finalise the business rescue process and see if a new airline can rise out of the ashes. Let's get an investor perspective on all of this. We're joined by Attard Montalto from Intellidex. Peter, so we are taking on more debt, but not completely blowing up the credit card. Is that a fair assessment of today's announcement?
Well, I think if you had a credit card that was getting towards 100% of your national income, as the debt to GDP is now going to be getting to, then I think your bank would be pretty worried. But the key here is that there are quite a lot of cuts going on beneath the surface, but we really need to think about the credibility of those. There's basically a zero nominal wage increase for public sector employees for the full 3 years ahead, which I think is going to be politically exceedingly challenging through, of course, ANC elections, national elections, actually to deliver. And then there's a lot of expenditure that's not recognised in here today. There's more money required from Land Bank that hasn't been penciled in, and potentially a lot more guarantees activated for things like dental as well. So there are a lot of risks here. So the problem I think we have analysing this is in some sense it's more credible than June. The active scenario in June was not credible, but also there's still huge downside risks to the outcomes here, which we also have to think about.
I mean, will rating agencies, will global investors look at the details that there are? I hear you that there are some details outstanding, and say that we're being responsible, sort of balancing the need for growth. We can't be completely veering towards austerity measures given the crisis, and on the other hand, looking at our debt burden.
So the rating agencies, I think, will have a challenge getting out of National Treasury the detail that they really want, particularly on this compensation angle. And at the press conference earlier, the minister was really struggling to give the details that were required, I think, and the rating agency would have been expecting him to give in subsequent calls he's doing this evening with the rating agencies. And we need a lot more detail. I think we have to remember by February there's going to be, still a lot of outstanding questions from the court case around the wage bill. There's going to be also still a lot of uncertainty around the next year's negotiation cycle on wages. That will have barely started probably by the time of the budget. And so one can't just keep leaving all this stuff outstanding. It's eventually going to catch up with the government and into debt to GDP. But the other angle that the rating agency will be thinking a lot about is what is fundable here. And we have seen issuance levels pushed up for the coming 2 years. And that's going to be hard for the market to swallow, I think, particularly if we see any tightening in interest rates from the US. Or from offshore, and really now skating very, very close to a level of issuance coming from National Treasury, I think that may not be fundable and may mean falling over the edge of the fiscal cliff.
He was talking about lending costs coming down, though. I mean, this has always been the concern that the huge cost to borrowing, you pay the interest, it crowds out other spending. But he said some of that is coming down. Is that because we're lending from the IMF and those sort of things? Or, I mean, we're in junk status. Has this whole issue of borrowing costs been overblown, Peter?
So I've been digging into numbers here, after the speech, and this was quite a confusing statement, as you say. What they mean is that the average cost that South Africa pays per unit of debt is going down. That's because interest rates are lower in the front end of the yield curve as the SARB has cut rates. So the sort of per unit of debt cost is cheaper. So the problem is South Africa is racking up debt much faster than that fall in the cost of debt. And as a result, debt service costs are going up versus their estimates in the budget in February by around 13 billion next year, 27 billion the year after. So the cost of debt service is going up, even if the individual per unit bit is actually going down.
All right, thank you for explaining that. Then SAA, I mean, it's small in the big picture, perhaps 10.5 billion, but does that send the wrong message to investors?
Well, I think it sends the wrong message about the politics of this ultimately, and the ability for National Treasury to really hold the line. And this has been the complication of the SAA issue between Pravin Gordhan and Minister Mboweni. Is that more recently Minister Gordhan has been saying that it's government policy that this must be funded and therefore Treasury must provide. And that is indeed true. The key problem here is that the decisions on this were actually made around February when both the ANC, NEC and the Cabinet decided that SAA must be funded. We've had loads of fun and games since then and going around the houses. But that was the core moment back in February, actually, already, when Treasury already lost. And therefore, it has to be funded, as Pravin Gordhan has said. But no, and I think this sends totally the wrong signal overall in terms of the cuts having to be made elsewhere. Treasury has been quite strategic. They have a table in some of the accompanying documentation showing basically people's, police and healthcare and education, etc., being cut to pay for SAA. But this is the choice that government fundamentally has made, and they will ultimately have to have the consequences.
All right, thank you for your analysis tonight, Peter Attard Montalto from Intellidex.